So without further ado, I'm going to bring Angela on and we're going to talk all about communication. Angela is a communications expert and she has so much to offer in this conversation. So I'm excited to have her on. Angela, welcome to Lovable Leader Launch Event.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. What a lineup you have. This is so amazing. Thank you for
Right?
inviting me.
Oh,
Yeah.
of course. I'm so thrilled that you're here. And when it came to thinking about, talking about communication, I mean, you were one of the first people that came to my mind. I thought, well, I need a communications expert. Who should I bring on? Angela. So thank you so much for making the time for me to come and talk about this stuff.
Of course. And I just want to say, I've been on lots of podcasts and lots of interviews, and you were one of the most well-researched, thoughtful interviewee, people that interviewed me. So thank you for always doing that extra work and being empathetic and understanding your audience, all the keys to great communication. But it really stood out to me. And so that's why I'm showing up for you today.
Thank you so much. I work so hard to be a good interviewer. And I think
know
to
you do.
myself, I think to myself, I want the people that spare their time for me because let me, a little quick sidebar here.
Yeah.
The whole reason I started podcasting was because I was like, so wait a minute, you're telling me that people will set aside half an hour to an hour to talk to me. I can just get brilliant people to come and talk to me and they'll just talk to me for free. And I can just ask them anything I want. And somebody was like, yeah, well, that's kind of how it works. And I was like, well, this is amazing. So I want to make it worth it for the people that are setting aside the time for me. So I always want to make sure that, that they feel welcome, that they feel supported, that I'm helping to let their light shine. And then in service of the audience, I think to myself, well, if I can put my guest in the best possible light and let them shine and let their genius come through, then my audience is going to get something from that. So I work really hard at that. And I also just love that I get to meet people and form new connections. Like it's really cool that, you and I met, back in kind of like the speaker circle, and then we connected on the podcast and now we're connected and you're here for this. And it's just really exciting.
Yeah, no, I love it. And that's a lesson in communication for those listening is that it shows that you're a really good interviewer. And not everyone is. You can do things halfway, just like a leader. You can do things halfway. You can show up and go like, oh, I have 5 questions I want to ask, same 5 stock questions. You'll still get an interview. You'll still get a podcast. Just like as a leader, you can show up halfway. You can tell people what to do. You're still a leader. You still have the title. But when you do that extra effort to understand your audience, what they need and what your guest needs, and, putting in that extra work that people think is invisible, I believe that it shows. And I believe that's what we're moving towards is the people who put in that extra work like you do, the ones that show up as lovable leaders are going to get the benefit.
Thank you. Yeah.
And the act of service to contribute too, as well.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. And it's honestly why I structured this entire event the way I did, which is I didn't want to bring people like yourself on to talk about my book. I wanted to bring you on to talk about what you're good at, to talk about your area of expertise. So I want to start by reading something from your website to kind of contextualize the conversation we're going to have, because I loved it when I saw it on your website and I was like, this is amazing. So in leadership, communication drives results. Being able to communicate authentically and powerfully can help executives command attention, motivate and inspire people, strengthen relationships, share their vision internally and externally. So in my book, I talk about the spectrum of communication, where on one side you have inform and influence and inspire, and on the other side, confuse and subordinate and demotivate. And you have this depth of expertise in communication and often cite these kind of 3 elements that people can improve. There's confidence, there's clarity, and there's connection. So talk to us about why these are important for today's leader. Like why do those things matter?
Yeah, I want people to think about, our world is more content, more. More is not necessarily better. What we really need is deeper connection, and connection as humans, with each other, but also as especially important as a leader. Now, how do you get that connection? Now, I believe in order to be really connected, it's really about knowing who you are as well. But number one, it's understanding your audience. Right. So whenever you're a leader for whatever organization, it's being able, it's said in your book too, being able to put yourself in their shoes. What are their pain points? What do they want? What are they experiencing? What are they going through? To understand them, right? And that's how you create the connection. And also to understand yourself. So a lot of my work, people come to me like, oh, how do I be a better communicator? Which will give some tips and different things. But it's really about understanding who you are, right? So the process of being you amplified. How do you move people to action if you don't know what you are, what you stand for, and how you want to show up? Right. So yes, it's understanding the people that work with you, work for you, your peers, the people above you, but also understanding who am I, what do I stand for, and how do I want to show up in the world? And that is the connection. Now, the confidence piece is really about owning your voice and your power to trust that and when you've gone through that process for yourself, you know who you are, what you stand for, and how you want to show up, the confidence will come through because you're embodying who you are. And then clarity, of course, is to be able to communicate your message, your thought, your vision in a way that people can hear you, right? Clarity, you can communicate and you can be clear, but if they can't hear you and internalize it and take that vision, then that's the disconnect. So all those together, clarity, confidence, and communication, it comes from knowing your audience, how to empathize with them and what they need, and also knowing yourself and doing that internal journey for yourself to be you amplified ultimately.
I absolutely love this because, I know you didn't do this intentionally, but this just amplifies and really puts an exclamation point on everything that I discussed this morning with my guests.
Mm.
Starting with the process of introspection and understanding, like, what's your purpose, what's your goal, what's your mission, what are you after, and looking for that as part of the way that you're going to be able to develop a connection with people. I mean, one of the reasons why I think you and I have, been able to connect so deeply is because we both share a passion for the importance of communication, and we both share a passion for our individual work. And I think we see that in one another, and that helps to create
Mhm.
connection. So you spoke a little bit about empathy. I think there's a lot there about listening to your audience and what they want. But I think you brought up a good point, which is also being curious and listening to yourself about what's important to you so that you can come through in that authentic way that allows you to bring that confidence.
Yes, and that's where it is. It's like when you know who you are, and sometimes you don't have you never gone through that process. I mean, the whole process I've discovered you amplified, and now working with a lot of executives, they're so busy. They don't have time, right? You have your own tasks, and now you're like in a leadership role where you have to tell other people what to do and make sure they're growing, and you don't take the time to really go, what are my core beliefs? Who am I? What do I stand for? How do I want to show up for the company? How do I want to show up for myself? How do I want to show up for my team? And so I think leaders do need to set aside some time. First, get your tasks done. And if there's deadlines, but that self-discovery journey is everyone's going to have to do it on their own time. Sometimes it's the best, professional development journey. If you're an entrepreneur, you start your own company, it's a lot of personal development. If you step into a leadership role, which you've mainly just been a doer versus a leader, you start to, you can do it a piece at a time, but it's so important, that personal journey. But, executives and leaders, sometimes they just don't have time for it, but you have to make the time because it's really important. It's the foundation of everything.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that we're like taking the time to really pause on this point and talk about the introspection work and taking the time to do that work with yourself, because I think that it would be difficult for a leader, especially a new manager, which is, again, who my book is really designed for, is the new managers coming in. They're trying to figure out their way around, to your point, that maybe they were a doer and they got promoted into this new position. And now we're saying, okay, develop connection, build trust, build care,
Yeah, you're
make
like,
it all happen. Right. And they're
what
like,
do you
okay,
do?
but like, who am I? Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like, I want to talk to you about, like, how can you project confidence and how can you make sure that you're more clear? But how can any of that actually happen until you're really clear on what your leadership journey is about and what strengths and weaknesses you bring, because you can't be vulnerable and connect with someone if you haven't done that work.
Yeah. And so on a deeper level, people come to me because they want to give a speech or they want to start doing more videos or they
Yep.
want to show up better at work. And you said the introspection work is like, how do you even start with that? And the first piece is, taking a look at, like, what do you actually believe? Like, how do you want to show up? Like, what do you feel about the company? What do you feel about yourself? What are your core beliefs? So, my whole work is about power, presence, and representation. So I'm very clear on what I stand for, but I didn't know that before. I was a TV news anchor. And when I left to start my communication business, I had left the business after my son was born. And I built this business and I started going on TV and doing these interviews. I had a blog called The Zen Mom. I didn't know what I stood for. Didn't matter that I was on TV and a good communicator. I didn't know what, like, I didn't know. And so I wasn't able to communicate my vision, my value, because I didn't know what my vision was. So I kind of took a step back and going, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And the core that I got to, why my work is so important, is that when the roundabout way of answering your question, but I sat down with myself and I go, what does I actually want to do? What do I truly believe in? That really, what gets you upset? What are, like, some non-negotiables for you? What do you stand for? What are the things that make you go, no, that is not okay? And it doesn't have to be related to your work, but mine was, my parents were Chinese immigrants. and they never really, their voices got shut down because of circumstance, situation, not because of their personality. And I never want to see someone feel less than or feel that their voice is stifled. And I remember this was 10 years ago, and I sat down, I go, what do I believe in? And I believe that everyone has a voice and everyone should not feel less than. And so my mission in my life is to help people own their voice and their power in their personal lives, as well as, to move things forward, the leaders, the thought leaders that are creating change. So I think for an individual, it seems really deep, but it doesn't have to be, there's a process I take people through You Amplified. But for you, if you just have some time, it's really like, what are the things, the through line? You may have different jobs in a different industry, but what's the through line that really drives you? And you always kind of come back to that. So that's like your core belief. And also, and the ways of having that presence. And when you really know kind of what you stand for, that's the deeper foundational work. And I also have some tips if people just want to show up with more presence and communication and clarity, we can talk about that as well.
Yeah,
but that's kind of like my story of how I got to like, what do I believe in? And really taking that time, all the times where I get upset about things, all the times where I feel like that thing in my gut, it's a through line.
Yeah, it's like I heard someone ask the question, what moves you, right? And when you focus on like what's the thing that causes you feel the lump in your throat, or like that stirring in your belly where you're like, that's an injustice that I can't take, or that's a thing that needs to change in the world, or that's a thing that really just excites me and makes me giggle like a kid again. That's a thing that I think is worth looking for. And I recently put together a blog post on my blog about my purpose-driven content strategy. And it's basically the content strategy extension from me discovering what is the purpose? What am I after? What am I trying to do for people? What does my life's work mean? And I think that until you get into like a legacy mindset, like what's the legacy of the work you want to leave behind? It's really difficult to be aligned behind something really big. But I think to your point, sometimes that stops people from trying to find the very first thing that they can get excited about.
Yeah.
So they're like, oh, I have to change the world. No. You just have to find the thing that moves you at the start. So I also wanted to take a quick detour because I do want to get all of your tips on clarity and presence and that. But as you were talking about power and purpose and these various things, made me think I want to make sure people know about your podcast, The Power of Only, and how that fits into your story as well. Because I think that that's a really important component to the work that you're doing as well. So can you just quick give a little pitch for your podcast and what it's about and why you chose to start it? Because I think it dovetails nicely into this.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, The Power of the Only, I went to a couple conferences. This is before the pandemic. And I was telling a story about how when I was younger, I was the only this, or I was the only Asian reporter. I was the only girl in my school that did that. I was the only woman speaker at conferences. And it came to me, it's like, I'm always the only. And studies had come out that when you're the only or the only woman in the room, it's more difficult, right? Your voice gets drowned out. It's harder. And it can be. And it's not just about women. I felt like, when you feel like the only one, like you're the only one, it takes a certain skill set to kind of overcome that. But I've always felt empowered by being the only. Didn't always start off that way, not when I was a little kid, but as I've grown into my leadership. And so I wanted to change the narrative that, yes, it is more difficult, but it is time now for us onlys to step up. I've always felt like the only one. And sometimes there's to see the beauty in that. And yes, it's hard, but to see how the onlys are the ones that are going to create something new. And so when you're on the path of the only, so The Power of the Only is about bringing it together, thought leaders. I have speakers and authors and, and entertainment. I used to work in the entertainment industry, newscasters, journalists, media people. And my whole focus is helping people own their power, own their voice, and move into their leadership and create something new. But now, the leadership, and that's what you're creating too, is that we need to create a new definition of leadership. And by showcasing other onlys, we're creating our own paths, right? I have filmmakers that are doing different things, women, men, people of color, leaders, people that are creating change that they're like, feel like they're the only one. And when they're younger, they felt like the only one. And I wanted to find out the through line. Even though you felt like the only one, how did you break through those barriers to get to where you need to be, to get people to think only? And that is my, eventually it'll be a book, but it's the podcast right now, The Power of the Only. And it's kind of creating, I have 5 principles, but I want to move people to think differently. And in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, same thing that you're doing, we have to create a new mindset, a new shift of what's possible. And it's not the old model of leadership, and it's not the old model, and the onlys will create it.
I love it. In terms of this idea of being the only, and I want to stick on that for just a second, because I think one of the things that a lot of new managers may face is when they're on a team, and let's say they're leading a team and they have maybe an only or several onlys.
Hmm.
The job of communication of a leader is to inform, it's to influence, it's to inspire. How do you believe that leaders can create a space that is safe, where there's care, where there's trust, so that people who feel like an only no longer feel necessary? I realize there's power in being the only, but how can we create spaces where they don't feel as if the only is a thing that's separating them, but
Yeah.
instead it's something that empowers them and the environment is one where they feel part of the team? What are
Yeah.
some of the things that you think leaders can do to make that environment happen?
Great question. Yeah. And so what I talked about originally was coming from the empowerment standpoint, as we as onlys need to step up with our skill sets and all that. But yes, part two. So part of my talks is like, how do we become empowered? How do we show, honor our past and honor our future? But as leaders, that may not be the onlys. Maybe they're driving the team. You need to see the value in the onlys on your team, right?
Yeah.
For the bigger picture, to kind of, like you said, the listening mode, that when you do things a traditional way, and also be conscious of your own self-conscious, unconscious biases, and it's not so much as and that allows the freedom in the room for new ideas to come. So the onlys need to own, they have to be confident, clear, and connected. They need to own their own value and show up at the table fully. But sometimes they can't show up at the table fully if the culture is not conducive to that, or if the manager is not conducive to that, right? Sometimes it can be the culture is conducive to it. They're saying, yes, show up as your true self. Yeah, right. When you show up and it gets rejected, right? It's a lot of times I'll find cultures that are accommodating, but maybe the leader, the person right above them, they'll say like, oh, but my manager won't let me do that, or they don't like that. So then it's the manager. So how can they do that? By really taking a look at, what are the ways that you lead? Who are the people? You're always going to be attracted and inspired by people that are like you sometimes, right? Like I like go-getter people. If I see them, but there are other people. If you're an extrovert, you like people who are bold and loud and whatever, but introverts can add value too. So it's not just about women or people of color. It's like introverts versus extroverts, a person who's, does things differently than you do, and see the value that they add as a whole to your team, and creating a space where it's not just one way of leading and one way of being. Because, when you're a leader, and the old way of doing it is like, I'm successful, I'm like this, model this is the way we need to do our vision plan, this is the way we need to get things done. And if you're a go-getter, you're going to be attracted to those people who do things the way that you do.
Yeah.
But to be a leader with vision, you have to see the value in what everyone at that table brings, and create an environment where maybe someone that isn't only, or doesn't think exactly the way you do, and you don't have to change the way you lead, but you have to be open-minded to new ideas, and maybe start seeing things in a different light, that there is power in being the only one. And there may be some truth to what they're saying, or that adds value, that isn't just other people copying the same train of thought. Right. I
Yeah.
would bring things to the table in the newsroom. I would bring things that's like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And you need to have leaders that are willing to listen to those moments, because those are the moments that can actually change your team, create your vision, all kinds of things. So
Yeah,
have to be excited.
there's so much there, because I think the way that we speak, the words that we choose, the tone that we take, our body language, all of that communicates our receptivity to alternative ideas. As leaders, we sometimes feel like we have to walk in the room and own the space and take charge and all of that. But oftentimes that leaves people feeling excluded, that their way of doing things that may be different isn't welcome at the table. I've
Yeah.
only recently, in the past several years of my life, realized that that's been a trend for me in my entire life when I wasn't on the leadership side, where because of my ADHD and the way that I process information, the way that I work, that oftentimes I felt like a failure. I felt like an outcast because I worked a certain kind of way. And there wasn't a space being created where, if we had just slightly shifted to adjust to the way that maybe I work, to include me in the team in the way that I work, I could have provided tremendous value. So I've brought all that trauma with me into all of these different work situations, and have tried to, at least in the book, encourage people, like you're saying, to create the space to allow people who are maybe presenting information in a different way, or think a different way, or come from a different background, to present their ideas not as like, oh, we'll accommodate that, but to, as a leader, open your mind to, maybe I could learn something from that, that like, I'm not
Yes.
actually the default. I'm just the person who has this title. So let me open the floor and let all of the ideas come into flourish.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be super complicated. It's not like, there's a lot of D&I training and unconscious bias training, and, don't want leaders to feel overwhelmed. You
Yeah.
just have to be open-minded and listen and say, huh, is there a different way? that I'm not seeing, and just be open. Doesn't mean you have to execute on whatever they thought, but creating that space, you don't know what's going to, it's like a brainstorming session. I was talking to someone, it's not so much of a meeting as it is sometimes allowing the room to brainstorm and having the freedom to brainstorm. You don't have to take on their ideas. You're still the leader. You make the decision. It's still going to be run the way you want to run it. So it's not like you're giving up your power. You're just opening up your power to new possibilities, which makes you a more powerful leader. And I do think it does has to go twofold though, right? Like you said, you carried with you your trauma of like maybe when you weren't in a safe space of like, oh, they're not going to listen to me, it's not the right way. There can be a lot of that. You can have a very lovable leader, and then the individual who's the only maybe stopping themselves because they're like dealing with an old, oh, they're not listening to me, they don't like my ideas. So it's twofold, right?
Yeah.
The individual needs to show up, own their voice, own their power, be clear on what the value they provide, and also own the value they provide. Because maybe in an old organization, they didn't feel like their value was recognized. And so they're afraid to show up. So that's what I help people with, is that internal, how do you break through your own to show up fully, but also to change the narrative for leaders to see that everyone has something to add. And then that actually makes you a more powerful leader, not less.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things I have in my book is about the idea that a leader's job is to take various stands for things, right? So you have to stand for the value of the work itself. You have to stand for your people against outsiders. But one of the ones that I put in there, I think when people read through that section, they go, oh, that's interesting, is that you actually have to stand for people against themselves sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point of when people are bringing with them trauma of past work situations or anything else where maybe they're not feeling like they can bring their full selves, it's your job to actually stand for them as a leader and say, I'm going to be here to support you. I'm going to keep encouraging you to bring yourself and be there to support you in what you need so that you feel safe here to be able to bring your best self to this job and
And
to
it's
this
like a
role.
coach, right? You're like their cheerleader and their coach, and all these skills are new. And that's why I love
Yep.
your book. It's like, it's kind of like a step-by-step process of things that may come up for those managers that are like,
Yeah.
I don't know, I haven't done any personal development. I don't know how to look at my unconscious biases. You want me to find my vision and know what? No, you don't have to get so
Yeah.
complicated. It's just, you have to be open-minded, and you do lay it out in a step-by-step process. And when you have the time, you should do the lovable leader, but just overall, just changing your shift going, I can still be the leader and not have to always be the loudest voice in the room or do everything. You have to be able to facilitate, coach, empower, and bring people up. And then you have this whole team behind you. Right. And so that's amazing. It's like helping to grow people versus I'm the leader, listen to me.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into some of your specific direct areas of expertise around coaching people on how they show up. So I want to basically spend the rest of our time together talking a little bit about some of the things that you coach people on so that they can show up and you've got somebody brand new in a leadership position. They're trying to earn the respect. They're trying to earn the trust. They're trying to communicate that they care. They want to show up powerfully, but they don't want to be overbearing. What are some of the tips that you would start people off on? Very baby steps, training wheels to starting to get their various modes of communication on the right track as a new leader.
Yeah. I want to start with a couple tactical things so people can walk away with
Perfect.
something that just tactical that they could do that makes them seem more confident. And then I want to talk about the meaning behind it of why that's important. So, a lot of times people a lot of people are online now, right? You're communicating with your team. You notice you have great lighting. So do I. You're not a professional studio, but now we've all figured out that, part of showing up properly is, are you showing up the way you want to be perceived? Right.
Mhm.
Like, yes, it's, if your team already knows you, you can show up in your sweats or whatever, but are you projecting what you want? Like, is this your brand? Like, right? Even though you're not an on-camera person, you're an executive or you're a leadership person. It's like, are you reflecting the values that you want? So for on camera, it's like as simple as sitting up straight, like, versus me telling you what to do like this.
Yep.
Like, well, today on the call, I think what we need to focus on is the 3 goals versus like, how are you guys doing? Today, what we want to focus on is the 3 goals that we're excited about. So who has some ideas, right? Just the way you sit, the way you look into the camera. Now, this is hard because not everyone's, even in person though, it's the same thing. And so those are some on-camera tips. Sit up straight, looking at the camera, not looking at the screen. And not and the feeling that you bring to it. So I have a U amplified performance formula process. It's called Amplify. So I'll just briefly go over it. And if you'd like more information, it's on my site. It's a free like mini course. It kind of walks you through each of these concepts, but it's audience, message, purpose, lead, image, and feeling, right? Do you know your audience? What do they want? What's your message? Right? What do you actually want to for this specific meeting? What's your message for the specific meeting? What's
Yep.
your purpose? Well, the purpose is I want to get 2 volunteers to help me with this. The purpose is I want to grow my team and have them have a new sales budget. The purpose is I just want to act like I'm accessible because it's our first meeting. You have a purpose for each meeting. How are you going to show up? How are you going to lead? And image. I know I'm going through a lot, but I wanted to highlight an F is feeling. So the number one thing is, what energy are you bringing? That's the one tip I want people to say, no matter what, if you're on camera, off camera, in person, you sit down with yourself. If you're a new manager, how do I want to show up and what feeling do I want to bring? That's one simple tip, is like, you're new, you're scared, you're concerned, they trust me. There's all these things going on in your head. But if you say, no, the feeling I want to create for my team today is connection. I want them to feel good, or I want to showcase confidence. So you got to think about, what is the feeling you want to bring to the table? As a keynote speaker, that's what we do, right?
Yep.
Like, what is the energy I want to bring today? And then how do I want them to feel? How do I want them to walk away? So the one question you ask yourself, how do I want to show up? What's the feeling I want to have from this meeting, or this talk, or this virtual talk, or this in-person meeting, or this one-on-one interview, or this podcast? And the second question is, what do I want their feeling when they walk away?
Love
Right?
it. Love that.
Right. And
My
so
art teacher used to ask, what do you see and how does it make you feel? And I've remembered that since, it's like 20 years ago, he said this to me, but I think about it. And I put this in a post where I talk about writing effective emails. Whenever I write an email, the first thing on my mind, and the most important thing, is, how do I want people to feel after reading this? And as I write it, I read through it. I think, how will they feel reading this? How will they feel reading this? How will they feel reading that? And I go back through it until I am as certain as I possibly can be that when they read it, the feeling that they feel is the feeling I intended for them to have.
exactly. And I went through a lot of details. Like you said, if you want to go to my site, you can find more. But it's like, ultimately, all those fit together in a little package, right? Knowing
Yep.
your audience, knowing your message, da, da, da. But if you don't have a lot of time, you don't want to do a course, you don't want to do that. It's just very simple. How do I want to show up today? How do I want to feel? And how do I want to make other people feel? And hopefully, all the things that you've learned, all the skills that you already have, will show up because the energy that you bring to it is authentic. Right. And then you can learn the other things, right? Like, what are the tactical things, or how can I set up my camera properly, or how can I make my lighting better? Or, and I'll give you another tip: trusting your words. You can be more confident by not rushing through things and talking really fast, and trusting your words, and it using periods and commas.
Yes.
Right? Trusting your words. So all that inner stuff helps you trust your words, helps you show up more confident, helps you be more clear. So there are tactical things you can do, like, pausing, not talking too fast. But if you don't want to deal with all that and get real technical and all into that, how do you want to feel, and how do you want others to feel? And that can shift your presence and your communication immediately.
I love it. At the beginning of any meeting, for a leader, you're stepping into a meeting, you're stepping into a virtual meeting, you're about to write an email. What is my purpose of doing this? How do I want to show up, and how do I want others to walk away from? I think that's a really, really great set of tips for any leader to take away from this session today. So we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to ask you the final question that I'm asking all of my guests today. So the title of this book, just as soon as I said it out loud, it rang for me, and it felt right, because it made me think of people in my life that I would consider lovable leaders. These were people that I knew cared. I knew that I trusted. I knew that they would provide safety for me wherever they said we were going. So I want to ask you, from when I say lovable leader and you think about your past and your present, who comes to mind for you, and what would you say characterizes that person?
Yeah, I have to go a little bit opposite to show what is not a lovable leader, and then talk a little bit of lovable leader, because I came from really hard industries. Entertainment. I worked in Hollywood, right out of college, and I worked in the news business. And wonderful people who want to do good and change the world and tell stories, but not a lot of good leaders necessarily. And it's the old school. This is why I want to bring this out, because it's such a contrast to what you're trying to create, which is a new generation of lovable leaders. The old way, unfortunately, and when I was coming up through the ranks, was the old school authoritative leadership. And so, in the news business and whatever, it was like, there were some major tantrums. People like, I worked for a big leader who had another CEO leader screaming, yelling, throwing things. And this is abuse. It was not okay. So that's the model that I came from growing up. And then the lovable leader are a lot of the leaders so it's shifting. So the reason I say this is because there is an old way of leading that is still kind of shifting. People who are the old authoritative way, there's I don't want to say bad, but there's an old way of leading that has a little bit of abuse in it, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit toxic, and our toxic culture isn't fully gone. And then as people evolve, there's that middle ground where like it's no longer toxic. People are empathetic. They want to be strong leaders and good managers, but there's a little bit of still the old school way of like, no, what I say goes, and I'm going to come in, I'm going to rule. And so we're trying to shift it to the lovable leader. And so the lovable leaders that I want to highlight right now are a lot of the clients that I've worked with that are coming to me. They're going, Angela, I want to go deeper within myself. So the lovable leaders I want to highlight are all the ones that are saying, I trust my team. They're advocates for their team. They're coaches. They understand themselves fully. They show up fully, and they're there to make the other individual the best that they can be. And so that requires a new skill set. And so I guess one example, it's funny, I was talking to my husband last night. And so I have a lot of different clients that are showing up as lovable leaders because they're taking the time to go, how do I want to show up for my people, and how am I going to make them the best? Right. And that's very different than the old school way that I grew up with. Get me a salad, or this is what's happening. And people learn. It's not the direct answer to your question, but I wanted to talk about this whole toxic environment because it's still there in a lot of places. People learn from the people that lead them, just like we learn from our parents. I saw generations of toxic leadership pass on from, I worked as an assistant. So if you had a toxic boss, that person, when they got to the higher ranks, they became a toxic boss because they knew this is how I went through the ranks. This is how I worked through. This is how I need to be.
Yeah.
So we now need to stop that pattern, whatever's not working, and create this new paradigm. But I actually would say the lovable leader was actually my husband. I've seen him grow his team. He is a executive search person, and I'm always amazed at, he's not necessarily a lovable leader with me and when we get into our thing, but for him as a leadership team, I'm just amazed how he can be a leader. He's a very type A, very dynamic, but he's constantly growing his team. He's listening to his team. He gives them responsibilities. He listens if there are things he's accommodating. I'm like, wow, you did that. Wow. Like that stuff's not going to get done. And you're still going to, he's like, it's okay. I need to give them something to help grow them. He's sending them to personal development seminars and giving them 3 days off to make sure that they grow as individuals. And so I think that, and even me, I was kind of like, well, then you got a lot of work to do if you have all 3 of your people out for 3 days to like grow themselves, right? Giving people the space to grow. So that's what came up for me the other day. Like he actually told me, he's like, yeah, I'm giving them, each members of my team. He wants to make sure all the team's on the same page for their own personal lives and their own personal leadership development. And he's giving them 3 days off to focus on them. In essence, will help the team and help the company. But so that's one example. But yeah, most of my clients, the ones that are willing to take a deeper look at themselves and also invest in their team, that I believe is the beginning of what lovable leadership needs to be. And seeing lovable, changing the definition of lovable, it's like kindness is not a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Like leaders want to be strong and big power words, but to change the definition of what makes a good leader is really important. And I honor you that you're kind of creating that template for people to follow and see it in a different light.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everything. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for supporting this launch event and for sharing as much as you've shared today. It's amazing. I encourage everybody watching either live or after the fact, go and check out all of Angela's work. Listen to the podcast. It's phenomenal. She was a guest on my podcast. You should maybe listen to it. So thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, just thank you.
Thank you so much. And congratulations. You did the book.
Thank you.
Book is coming up next. I know how much work it is, and I see the work that you put in. And so just yay.
If you ever want to talk about it, you let me know. I got your back.
Yay to you. And it's a lot of work behind the scenes. And I hope people buy the book and really, you've taken your brain and your wisdom and you put it into a handbook that people can just take. So I hope they absorb it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We'll talk soon.
Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Take care. Bye.